It is the 2nd of April, 1963. At the Portsmouth Naval Yard in Kittery, Maine, 33-year-old Lieutenant Raymond J. McCool is at work, making preparations for the relaunch of his nuclear submarine, USS Thresher. For the past 9 months, Thresher has been undergoing modifications, upgrades, and repairs after its initial sea trials. Like the other 111 crew members, McCool is eager to get back to sea and find out what his vessel could do. Lieutenant McCool is the reactor control officer of the Thresher and responsible for starting the reactor, increasing or decreasing the rate of reaction, and shutting down the reactor. In 20 hours, he and his crewmates were scheduled to be back at sea. But just then, McCool is informed he has a phone call. It is his wife, Barbara.
I feel terrible calling you, but something dreadful has happened. I was opening a bottle of rubbing alcohol and I accidentally squirted it into my eyes. It really burns. I tried washing it out with cold water, but it still burns, and my vision is blurry.
McCool rushes across the 8 miles to his home and transports his wife to the hospital. Her eyes are flushed clean and bandaged. She will be fine, but her eyes must stay bandaged for several days. Raymond and Barbara have 5 children, including a 6-month-old infant. How could he leave Barbara alone with 5 children while her eyes are bandaged? He calls the shipyard and speaks to his superior officer, Lieutenant Commander Pat Garner, and explains what happened. McCool tells Garner that he will try to find a nurse to care for Barbara, and he does not want to miss Thresher's cruise scheduled for tomorrow. Garner replies, "I'm ordering you to stay with Barbara." McCool insists he will make arrangements for Barbara, and he will be back on board the Thresher. Garner repeats his order for McCool to remain at home, saying, "Don't worry, Ray, there will be plenty more trips for you." For Raymond McCool, there would be no more trips on board USS Thresher. His shipmates, colleagues, and friends on board USS Thresher were forever lost to the sea. The story of the USS Thresher, today on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. I'm your host, Rich Napolitano. Thank you so much for listening. The world changed on August 6, 1945. The atomic bombs dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan by the United States introduced the world to the newly harnessed power of nuclear energy, along with its devastating and terrible potential as a weapon. Following World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States engaged in its Cold War race to build increasingly more destructive weapons, and in greater numbers, each taking turns outdoing the other. But as these superpowers played their dangerous game, nuclear energy as a fuel source was also being developed. During the cloak and dagger style intrigue of the Cold War, spies were constantly on the hunt for information and secrets that could give the upper hand to their homeland. In July of 1951, the United States Congress authorized the development of USS Nautilus, SSN 571, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. Her keel was ceremoniously laid down by President Harry Truman on June 14, 1952, at Electric Boat Company of Groton, Connecticut. Nuclear-powered propulsion was developed by scientists and engineers at the Naval Reactors Branch of the Atomic Energy Commission, led by Captain Hyman G. Rickover. The Nautilus launched on January 21, 1954, after 18 months of construction. First Lady Mamie Eisenhower did the honors of the christening. The performance of the Nautilus was overwhelmingly successful, setting speed and distance records for submerged vessels. The age of nuclear-powered submarines had arrived, and the major world powers raced to build bigger and better boats through the 1950s. Of course, submarine technology was not new in the 1950s. There are references going as far back as 332 BC of men submerging inside a glass barrel to study marine life. The first functional submarine with its own propulsion was the Drebbel 1, developed in 1620 by Dutchman Cornelius van Drebbel. His design used 12 oarsmen to propel the vessel underwater. Over time, a variety of submersibles and diving bells were developed, some more successful than others. In 1864, the Confederate States of America submarine H.L. Hunley became the first submarine to sink an enemy vessel when it brought down the sloop of war USS Housatonic. This attack sub used a torpedo attached to its bow to ram the Housatonic. Unfortunately, the blast of the torpedo also sank the Hunley. German U-boats were the scourge of World War I and World War II, as these underwater killers attacked both military and civilian targets. Submarines, up until this time, used battery power when submerged. They were forced to surface every so often, fire up their diesel-powered engines, and recharge the batteries, making them vulnerable to attack. The development of nuclear-powered submarines was a game-changer. The power plant on a nuclear sub was virtually silent and could run continuously for months, allowing submarines to stay submerged for greater periods. The Nautilus-class nuclear submarines were followed by Seawolf, Skate, Skipjack, Tullabee, and George Washington. Then, in 1958, the Thresher class was announced, and the keel of the USS Thresher was laid down at Portsmouth Naval Yard in Kittery, Maine, on May 28, 1958. The USS Thresher, SSN 593, was named after a successful World War II U.S. submarine of the same name, using the beautiful and sleek Thresher shark as its inspiration. Thresher would be an attack submarine, or a hunter-killer, meant to destroy Soviet November and Victor-class submarines. Its class designation of SSN indicates a submarine with nuclear propulsion. SSBN is given to nuclear-powered vessels that can launch ballistic missiles, while SSGN submarines are capable of launching guided missiles. Construction on the Thresher was slow, as Polaris-class ballistic missile submarines were taking precedence. She was designed to be 278 feet 6 inches long and 31 feet 8 inches wide at its maximum width. It could reach speeds of 30 knots, or about 34 miles per hour. It was built to dive to a depth of 1,300 feet, or 396 meters, and its 4 21-inch torpedo tubes could fire both anti-ship and anti-submarine torpedoes. Its tear-shaped hull was different from her World War II cousins. While surfaced, the design made her a bit clumsy, but more hydrodynamic while submerged, where she would spend most of her time. Thresher was designed to dive deeper, run quieter, and stay submerged longer than any other submarine in history. Thresher-class submarines were equipped with the most advanced sonar equipment of its time, the AN/BQQ-2. This was a passive sonar system, meaning it did not transmit a signal of its own in order to detect an echo, but used a system of underwater microphones, called hydrophones, that listened for sound waves in the ocean. Thresher's sonar had 1,240 hydrophones configured around a giant metal sphere, 15 feet in diameter. It was placed inside the bow of Thresher, and therefore its torpedo tubes were located amidships. The U.S. Navy was entering into a period of large-scale submarine production, and had plans on building 14 Thresher-class submarines and 11 more very similar designs. The USS Thresher was launched on July 9, 1960 at the Portsmouth Yard, and her deep black hull entered the Piscataqua River. She was the first U.S. submarine ever to be launched bow first. She was finally in the water, but much work was still to be done in her interior workings. Commander of the Thresher was Dean L. Axine, an experienced Navy man who attended the U.S. Naval Academy and the Navy Submarine School before going on 2 patrols of Japanese waters on board the submarine USS Parch, and later served as executive officer of the submarine Sea Robin. Commander Axine was very involved in the work being done to the Thresher. He knew every inch of the vessel and remained involved in its fitting out. Satisfied with the work, Axine took the Thresher out for her first sea trial on April 30, 1961. In addition to the Thresher's 16 officers and 96 crew, 40 guests were on board, including Vice Admiral Rickover himself. Axine took the Thresher out from the Portsmouth Yard until he cleared the coast, and then prepared for the vessel's first dive. It was a shallow one, to test the submarine's control systems. After the successful shallow dive, Axine took the Thresher down for a second test, but this time a little deeper. On the surface, the rescue ship Skylark was standing by and remained in communication with the Thresher. A deeper dive beyond the continental shelf was scheduled for the following morning, but since everything was thus far normal, Axine decided to proceed with the deeper dive. The Thresher cruised east for deeper water, with the Skylark again waiting above. Gradually, the Thresher submerged using its diving planes at its sail and stern, along with the propulsion system, to increase its depth. Crewmen busily checked and rechecked their gauges and equipment, performing a checklist of tests. All was well, but the Thresher needed to get down to its maximum depth of 1,300 feet. As the Thresher continued to descend, its instruments incorrectly indicated the vessel was approaching its maximum depth. Not taking any chances, Commander Axine abandoned the dive, ordered the Thresher to ascend to the surface, and returned to Portsmouth. The Thresher's faulty instruments were replaced quickly, and it successfully completed its dive tests. The USS Thresher was officially commissioned into the U.S. Naval Service on August 3, 1961. In his keynote speech, Vice Admiral Harold T. Duderman offered these words.
Today, as we commission Thresher and make her officially part of the Atlantic Fleet, we reach a point in submarine development long awaited by our Navy. Thresher is not just a new nuclear submarine. She is not just one more SSN to add to the too few that are already members of our fleets. She is not just another ship. She is totally different.
With the band playing patriotic marches, flags flying, and officers in their dress whites, visitors were treated to a grand affair. After the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner, Commander Axine ordered his executive officer to set the watch. On August 10, 1961, the Thresher embarked on its assignment to perform additional tests. Alongside the harbor tugs Wabansi and Montezuma, Thresher cleared the pier and entered the Piscataqua River channel. Within 90 minutes, she was in international waters, where she submerged and headed south toward the Bahamas. Thresher was now in what is called its shakedown period, when a vessel is put through a long list of exercises and tests to work out the kinks and allow the crew to become familiar with its operation. Commander Axine put his submarine and his crew through a series of engineering tests during the 1,300-mile voyage, before reaching her destination on August 14th. She was to perform sound tests in a deep water channel called the Tongue of the Ocean, between the islands of Andros and New Providence in the Bahamas. Over a 2-week period, tests concluded that Thresher was even quieter than the Navy hoped, powered by her virtually silent nuclear power plant. Following her sound tests, Thresher was ordered to the naval base at Newport, Rhode Island, where she would undergo testing of Mark 27 and Mark 37 torpedoes. In September of 1961, she engaged in exercises with the nuclear submarines USS Tullabee and USS Skate in waters off New London, Connecticut. Thresher was still in the midst of lengthy performance tests, including its state-of-the-art sonar system. Sonar technicians practiced finding and tracking the other vessels, and learned the nuances of the sophisticated new equipment. Dummy torpedoes were fired at practice targets, and snorkel tests ensured a fresh supply of oxygen was circulated inside the vessel. Thresher performed these and countless other tests while checking off nuclear submarine exercises 3 through 61. In October of 1961, Thresher was sent on another shakedown mission with USS Kavala, a diesel-electric submarine from the World War II era. This was a 3-week cruise to San Juan, Puerto Rico, during which the anti-submarine exercises were conducted. On October 30th, Thresher logged a reactor scram event, meaning a sudden shutdown of the nuclear reactor, and was forced into operating under reduced electrical power. This condition lasted for only 10 minutes, and the next day, Thresher conducted a scram drill simulating such conditions. Thresher arrived in San Juan on the morning of November 2, 1961, mooring alongside Kavala in downtown San Juan. As is customary while in port, its nuclear reactor was shut down. Normally, electricity from shore would supply power to vessels in port, but at this time the port in San Juan did not have the capability to do so. Instead, Thresher's diesel generator provided power on board, but later that evening a malfunctioning cooling pump caused the generator to fail. Thresher's nuclear plant could be restarted, but it would take time, and more importantly, it requires a tremendous amount of electricity to start. With no other options, engineers switched power to the Thresher's battery. Power from the battery was limited, and non-critical systems, including the air conditioning, were shut down. The subtropical heat of Puerto Rico and the heat generated from the nuclear reactor had temperatures inside the Thresher reach 140 degrees, and crewmen had to be removed due to heat stroke. As much battery power as possible was directed to the reactor in order to reach the critical stage, when the reactor is self-sustaining. The battery, however, was depleted before the reactor could be started, shutting down all systems. Thankfully, the diesel-powered Kavala was moored alongside and provided power to restart the Thresher's reactor. Throughout the night, crewmen also repaired the diesel generator, and the Thresher was back at sea by the next day. From San Juan, Commander Axine took his vessel to Cape Canaveral, and then Fort Lauderdale, where she underwent testing of Subrock torpedoes. With Christmas approaching, Thresher was ordered to return to New London for extended yard time, where she would undergo repairs. But most of the crew's families had followed the men to Portsmouth, where they would temporarily reside. Commander Axine convinced his superiors to allow Thresher to put into Portsmouth instead, allowing many families to spend the holidays together. Thresher was scheduled for its post-shakedown availability. After initial period of testing and breaking in, submarines go back to the yard where repairs, upgrades, and refitting takes place. This is a lengthy period when the submarine's crew goes ashore, and repair work is done by the yard workers. This didn't sit well with Commander Axine, as he did not believe the crew had enough time to really see what the Thresher could do. Axine's superiors agreed, and by February of 1962, Thresher was back at sea and headed for New London to undergo tests of the vessel's advanced sonar system. For 3 weeks, various tests were conducted with the assistance of other Navy vessels and in conjunction with the Navy Underwater Sound Laboratory. In April of 1962, a group of both naval and civilian personnel from an anti-submarine warfare group boarded Thresher. They observed and discussed as Thresher engaged in exercises with the USS Kavala. Upon completion of these exercises, Thresher was sent to the naval base at Charleston, South Carolina, where she would take on members of various news agencies. While on board, many of the Thresher's controls and gauges were covered, to contain the top-secret nature of Thresher's capabilities. Following her trip to Charleston, Thresher was sent to the General Dynamics Electric Boat Yard in Groton, Connecticut. Here, she was fitted and prepared for her explosive shock testing. These would measure how well the Thresher could withstand attacks from depth charges from surface vessels. After she was prepped and ready, Thresher was sent to Key West, Florida to the testing area. En route to Key West, Thresher stopped in Port Canaveral, Florida for special exercises with the ballistic missile submarine USS Thomas A. Edison. While undergoing routine mooring procedures in port, the tug Hollywood rammed Thresher while attempting to nudge her into her berth. A 3-foot gash was ripped open in the Thresher's hull, on the port side below the waterline. Fortunately, it was in the vessel's ballast tank and did not damage her pressure hull. The ballast tank filled with water, and Thresher developed a list to port, which was corrected by filling the starboard ballast tank. This damage would need to be repaired before Thresher could undergo explosive shock testing, and was sent back to Groton, Connecticut for repairs. Within 2 days, Thresher was fully repaired and headed to Key West. The shock test would determine how much pounding the Thresher could take, and also measure how such blasting would affect the submarine's noise output. Preliminary sound tests were conducted at Tongue of the Ocean in the Bahamas, before continuing on to Key West. Surface vessels dropped depth charges at Thresher, which was navigating a carefully planned test route. Gradually, more powerful explosives were dropped at various depths, rattling the Thresher. The thundering booms popped rivets loose, shattered gauges, and tested the crew's nerves. For 2 weeks, the Thresher was blasted over and over, and while she suffered damage, it was all relatively minor, and results were overwhelmingly positive. Following these blast tests, additional sound tests were conducted, and it was determined she was still just as quiet as before. Finally, it was time to head back to Portsmouth, where she took on one last cruise before her yard availability. This time, there would be no tests, and no blasting, as the crew's families joined them on board for some much-needed family time. At the conclusion of this family pleasure cruise, Thresher was put into dry dock at Portsmouth for a scheduled 6 months of post-shakedown yard time. Commander Axine and his entire crew stayed on shore during this time, although they certainly kept an eye and a keen interest in the work being done on their underwater home away from home. Yard workers pulled out machinery, wires, piping, and tubing, and cut holes in the hull to remove large machinery. But the work was necessary, and she would be almost a new ship when the work was completed. 3 months into the Thresher's yard time, Commander Axine received devastating news. He had been reassigned as commander of the USS John C. Calhoun, an enormous 425-foot vessel. Designated SSBN 630, it was capable of launching 16 Polaris 3A ballistic missiles over 2,500 nautical miles. The Calhoun was a new James Madison-class nuclear submarine and would be a coveted position for any submarine commander. Anyone, that is, except Dean Axine. He felt a strong bond with his submarine and his crew, and he very much desired to remain commander of USS Thresher. After several appeals to change his orders, Axine accepted his fate. To replace Axine as commander of the Thresher, the Navy appointed 36-year-old Lieutenant Commander John Wesley Harvey. Harvey was considered an excellent officer on the rise. The young officer carried tremendous credentials, being a graduate of the Naval Academy in 1950, and later serving on board the first-ever nuclear submarine, USS Nautilus, and was on board when Nautilus became the first submarine to make a submerged transit of the North Pole in 1958. Harvey even achieved minor celebrity when he appeared on the popular TV quiz show Concentration in 1958, winning an estimated $4,500 in prizes. Thresher's new commander and its former commander were well acquainted with each other, having served together on board the Sea Robin and the Nautilus. Before Axine departed for his new post, the two officers went over every inch of Thresher, and Axine imparted all his knowledge and wisdom about his vessel to Harvey. After 6 months in the yard, work had not yet been completed. Thresher was a $45 million complex machine, so accuracy and precision took precedence over speed. Everything had to be tested and retested again, and finally, plates called hard patches could be welded back in place to seal off the hull, with all welds being X-rayed to ensure proper seals. Repairs would take another 3 months, during which time John Wesley Harvey was officially named as the new commander of USS Thresher. Finally, on April 3, 1963, Thresher was ready to launch. Moored at Pier 11 of Portsmouth Naval Yard, Thresher's crew buzzed with excitement. In the early morning hours, preparations were being made to depart for the first time in over 9 months. At 3:45 a.m., Chief Engineer Lieutenant Commander John C. Lyman started the 4-hour countdown to start the nuclear reactor. In 2 hours, he would pull the uranium control rods to speed up the reactions. By 7:30 a.m., the reactor was operating at capacity, and the electrical generator was producing enough power for maximum propulsion. A total of 129 people were on board when Thresher slipped out into the Piscataqua River for its final voyage. Harvey guided Thresher out into open waters. Of course, being a completely overhauled vessel, performance tests must again be conducted. While operating on the surface and heading east, the navigation and communication systems were tested. At 9:49 a.m. on April 8th, Thresher rendezvoused with the Skylark, a submarine rescue ship commanded by Lieutenant Commander Stanley W. Hecker. Skylark was specifically equipped to rescue a submarine, and would accompany Thresher, stay in communication, provide assistance if needed, and serve as a communication link to shore. Thresher and Skylark continued together further east out to sea, off Cape Cod, Massachusetts, to perform dive tests. First, a shallow dive would be conducted to test the integrity of the hull. As the Thresher submerged, the two vessels stayed in communication using the UQC, or underwater telephone. Commander Harvey then ordered the Skylark to rendezvous with him the following morning for deep dive tests, 220 nautical miles east of Cape Cod. This distance would put Thresher beyond the continental shelf, where depths quickly dropped from 600 feet to over 8,000 feet. With Thresher's maximum depth at 1,300 feet, this would provide adequate depth to conduct the test. However, if anything should go wrong and Thresher required assistance, Skylark would be unable to assist at that depth. Thresher traveled overnight to the rendezvous point, taking the opportunity to submerge and open her up to its maximum speed of 30 knots, The following morning, 6:35 a.m. of April 10th, Thresher arrived at the designated coordinates, with Skylark nearby in communication distance. By 7:47 a.m., Commander Harvey used the UQC to inform Skylark that he was preparing to dive to test depth. Nobody on the Skylark, including Commander Hecker, knew Thresher's capabilities, its maximum depth, or maximum speed, as this was highly classified information. Thresher was expected to communicate any changes in its course, depth, or speed to Skylark, as well as regular communication checks every 15 minutes. At 7:52 a.m., Thresher had leveled off at a depth of 400 feet and checked for leaks, reporting into Skylark of her progress. After 2 minutes, Harvey informed Skylark that future references to its depth would be in terms of the test depth, rather than using specific numbers. There were occasional ships that visited the area, including a number of Soviet fishing vessels, and the Navy did not want any information about Thresher's capabilities to be discovered. At 8:09 a.m., Thresher reported being at 1/2 test depth, and at 8:35 at -300 feet. Thresher checked in again 18 minutes later at 8:53, as it was approaching its test depth. All communications were logged on both vessels, and on Skylark, that task belonged to Lieutenant James D. Watson. Watson stayed in communication and tracked navigation throughout the exercises, and at 9:02 a.m. he received a request from Thresher to repeat a course reading. Watson's later statements were that communication between Skylark and Thresher were good at this point in time. At 9:12 a.m., a routine communication check was received from Thresher, and 1 minute later, Watson received a strange message. Have positive up angle, attempting to blow up. Blowing up refers to a submarine's ability to blast compressed air into its ballast tanks in an emergency, pushing out the seawater to make the vessel more buoyant. Commander Hecker later testified the message was, experiencing minor problem, have positive angle, attempting to blow. The 9:12 a.m. entry in Skylark's official log recorded a satisfactory communication check, with this additional report being added later without an exact time. Shortly after receiving this message, radio operators on Skylark reported hearing the distinct sound of high-pressure air being released. At 9:14 a.m., Skylark attempted to contact Thresher, but received no response. Commander Hecker personally asked Thresher, "Are you in control?" multiple times, but without reply. At 9:17 a.m., Skylark received an unintelligible message, but Lieutenant Watson believed he heard the words, "test depth." Just moments later, Watson heard a familiar sound, that of a ship breaking up underwater, a sound he heard many times during his service in World War II. He later compared the sound to that of a compartment collapsing. The depth of water was too great for Skylark to anchor or to release any marker buoys, but Hecker did make note of its position when it lost contact with Thresher. Skylark began searching the area, moving back and forth across the test area, scanning for any sounds from the Thresher. At 10:58 a.m., Skylark began dropping communication grenades into the water, which is a signal to a submarine to surface. Hecker also ordered a message sent to Submarine Development Group 2 in New London. The message read, "Unable to communicate with Thresher since 0917. Have been calling by UQC voice CW QRB CW every minute. Explosive signals every 10 minutes with no success. Last transmission received was garbled, indicated Thresher was approaching test depth. Position 41-43N, 64-57W, conducting expanding search." But sending this message using the dot-dash system took time. Skylark was not a sophisticated vessel and did not have the ability to communicate quickly. It took over an hour and a half to send this message, which was not received in New London until 1:02 p.m., nearly 4 hours after communication with Thresher was lost. The message was received by Captain J. Sneed Schmidt, commander of Submarine Flotilla 2, who was having lunch with 2 officers. While this was not an uncommon message to receive, he excused himself from his guests in order to address the situation. Schmidt then sent the message to Atlantic Fleet headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia, and within an hour, Schmidt was discussing the Thresher's situation with Vice Admiral Elton W. Grenfell, commander of all submarines in the Atlantic Fleet. At 1:32 p.m., Vice Admiral Wallace Beakley ordered the nuclear submarine Seawolf, a diesel-electric submarine, a rescue ship, and a rescue aircraft to the scene of the Thresher's disappearance. They were later joined by the salvage ship Recovery and an additional aircraft. At dusk of April 10th, Recovery discovered a patch of calm water covered with oil, a usual sign of a distressed vessel below. The Skylark and Recovery both picked up pieces of cork and yellow plastic, consistent with materials that were on board Thresher. While a positive ID of Thresher had not yet been made, the evidence indicated a submarine that had met its doom. Later in the evening, Navy officials began notifying next of kin that Thresher was missing. Where possible, Navy officers personally visited the families, and at 8:00 p.m., a public announcement was made, consisting of a one-page statement from Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral George W. Anderson. The second paragraph of the statement reads, "The next of kin of the crew of the nuclear submarine USS Thresher, SSN 593, are being notified that the ship is overdue and presumed missing." Thresher's former commander, Dean Axine, was notified of the missing submarine that evening, and he immediately drove to Portsmouth. At 9:30 p.m., Admiral Anderson held a TV press conference where he announced, "To those of us who have been brought up in the tradition of the sea, one of the saddest occasions is when we lose a ship." Out in the Atlantic, the search for Thresher continued, with Captain Frank Andrews of the destroyer USS Norfolk in command. Additional vessels, including the destroyers Wallace L. Hind and Yarnell, along with the submarines Seawolf and Sea Owl, scoured the area, searching for any clues or any sign of the lost submarine. The search and rescue continued throughout the night, and although there were some glimmers of hope, they all turned out to be false indications of USS Thresher. By 9:30 a.m. on April 11th, the USS Blandy arrived with Rear Admiral Lawson P. Ramage, Deputy Commander of Submarines in the Atlantic. Even more vessels arrived shortly later, consisting of the destroyers Samuel B. Roberts, Warrington, and the Sullivans, the rescue ship Sunbird, the research ship Atlantis II, and the oiler Waccamaw. When Admiral Ramage discussed the situation with Commander Hecker of the Skylark, Hecker did not mention Thresher's message of experiencing a minor problem, and did not report Lieutenant Watson hearing the sound of a ship breaking up. This would be a source of controversy for Commander Hecker during the forthcoming inquiry. In Washington, D.C., Admiral Anderson again addressed the media at 10:30 a.m., saying, "This is a very sad occasion for me, because very reluctantly I have come to the conclusion that the USS Thresher, which we have had for a time as missing, has indeed been lost." Anderson described the materials that had been found, and the oil slick on the water, as evidence of Thresher experiencing a catastrophic disaster, adding, "So I conclude, with great regret and sadness, that this ship, with 129 fine souls aboard, is lost." Concerns immediately arose over the vessel's nuclear reactor, and whether it posed any danger of contaminating the ocean. Earlier, Admiral Hyman Rickover released a statement on the matter. "I can assure you there is no radioactive hazard as a result of this unfortunate accident. Reactors of this type used in the Thresher, as well as in all our nuclear submarines and surface ships, can remain submerged indefinitely in seawater without creating any hazard." Samples taken from the water were tested and revealed only normal levels of radioactivity. Some conjectured enemy spies or possible sabotage, but Anderson confirmed no Soviet ships or submarines were in the area at that time. When asked if Thresher's communications indicated experiencing any trouble, Anderson, still not aware of the troubling message from Thresher, reported that all was normal. Search and rescue vessels continued searching throughout the day on April 11th, through gale-force winds and rough seas. The Sunbird discovered 2 rubber gloves, along with oil samples, cork, plastic, and a tube of Baker's flavoring. Day after day the search continued, with sonar readings indicating possible large masses on the ocean floor, but nothing to specifically identify them as being the Thresher. Given the extreme depth of the Atlantic in that location, the Navy sent the bathyscaphe Trieste from its home in San Diego all the way to Boston via the Panama Canal. A bathyscaphe is a submersible, free-floating vessel used to explore the extreme depths of the ocean. The Trieste had a large tank filled with 34,000 gallons of gasoline, which is lighter than water, to provide buoyancy. Ballast tanks were filled with iron pellets, and additional ballast tanks filled with water. An observation sphere at the bottom of the vessel could house 2 to 3 people, who could observe and maneuver the vessel. While not terribly mobile, the Trieste did have 3 small propellers for limited movement over short distances. Ideally, a bathyscaphe would submerge over an area that is already suspected to contain the target. When it needed to ascend, it would release its ballast of iron pellets to the ocean floor and rise to the surface. Trieste had previously explored the Marianas Trench in the Pacific Ocean, reaching a depth of 35,800 feet. Safely reaching 8,400 feet would be no problem for the Trieste. On June 23rd, the Trieste was preparing for her first exploratory dive, with assistance from the Fort Snelling and the Preserver. While submerged, the Soviet tanker Pokyatan approached the area, prompting the Fort Snelling to signal a message. "I am engaged in submarine survey work. You should stand clear of me." The Soviet vessel then moved away, off to the south. Several more Soviet vessels curiously poked around the area over the next several days. Trieste finally made her first dive in the Atlantic on June 24, 1963, with Trieste's commander, Donald Keach, and civilian researcher Kenneth Mackenzie on board. A 2-square-mile area was searched on her first dive, but produced no results. On its third dive, Keach and Mackenzie spotted a yellow rubber shoe cover, consistent with what Thresher's crew would wear in the reactor room. It was slightly folded over, but they could clearly see the letters SSN and the number 5. The rest was covered over, but it very likely was from the Thresher, SSN 593. Additional debris of paper and other small objects were seen scattered in the area before Keach took the Trieste back to the surface. Several more dives were made over the next 2 months, and on September 4th, a significant announcement was released by the Department of Defense. The location of structural parts of the Thresher on the ocean floor have been positively confirmed by the bathyscaphe Trieste. The associated operational aspects of the search for the nuclear submarine are being terminated. Navy officials later appeared at a televised press conference with a piece of twisted wreckage displayed in front of them. It was a 57-inch section of piping, attached to a section of sheet metal, and a rusted bracket. An extensive cross-agency team of naval and civilian scientists and researchers assisted in the methodical search for Thresher. Another group, called the Thresher Analysis Group at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, or TAG-HUI for short, carefully studied the section of structural wreckage brought up by Trieste. Secretary of the Navy Fred Korth read a prepared statement explaining the structural piece of Thresher was found by Trieste on August 28th and was part of the submarine's air filtration system in the galley area. The designation 593 boat was etched into the pipe, confirming it as being from Thresher. Trieste had observed a large debris field on the ocean floor, and it was determined the Thresher most likely disintegrated due to immense pressure. A second series of dives from Trieste was planned, but it was first in need of modifications and repairs. Trieste was sent back to San Diego, and it would reemerge as Trieste II in 1964, and participate in further exploratory dives at the site of the Thresher wreckage, with assistance from the recently acquired research vessel USS Mizar. On April 10, 1963, the very same day Thresher was lost, the Navy announced a court of inquiry headed by the president of the Naval War College, Vice Admiral Bernard Austin. Austin previously presided over the investigation into the fire on the aircraft carrier USS Constellation that led to the deaths of 50 civilian workers. The first witness to testify was Commander Dean Axine. Of the Thresher's loss, Axine said, "There is no way for me or anyone else to know what happened out there, but it must have been associated with a flooding-style casualty. And the flooding would have been almost instantaneous. Leaving such short time that the personnel could not react to let someone know they were in trouble." Axine also recounted his experiences during Thresher's first deep dive, when the instruments failed, and he terminated the dive. He also called the Thresher the best attack-class submarine our Navy has ever produced. The next witnesses were Lieutenant Commander James Watson, Boatswain's Mate 3rd Class Roy Moen, and Radioman 3rd Class Wayne F. Martin, all of the support ship Skylark. They all testified to Thresher's last message indicating the vessel was experiencing a minor problem, a positive up angle, and of hearing the sound of high-pressure air and a muffled crumpling sound. Although each of the men gave slightly different versions of the message, they were essentially the same, and clearly conveyed Thresher was in distress. The court was very interested in this and wanted to understand why Naval Command was just learning this information 3 days after the Thresher was lost. On April 15th, Lieutenant Commander of the Skylark, Stanley Hecker, testified before the court. He confirmed the last troubling message from the Thresher, and hearing the sound of high-pressure air. However, he knew nothing of the sound of a possible ship breaking up, saying he was unfamiliar with the sound. Hecker explained to the court that he was told nothing of Thresher's capabilities, and the only method of communicating with her was the underwater telephone. He went on to explain, almost plead, "I was willing to put down my 4 anchors, or even 6 anchors, every piece of line aboard, all my buoys or anything else to mark the spot, but I had only 7,200 feet of nylon line." The court grilled him about the Thresher's last communication and why he waited an hour and a half to report loss of communication with the Thresher, and why that message did not include any details of its last communication. When testimony reconvened on April 16th, Admiral Austin cited Hecker for his failure to accurately report Thresher's last communication. Austin admonished Commander Hecker, saying, "The court has concluded that your conduct as commanding officer, USS Skylark, as revealed by evidence presented to the court, appears to be subject to inquiry. The evidence in question reflects that you failed fully to inform higher authority of all the information available to you pertinent to the circumstances attending the last transmissions received by Skylark from Thresher on 10 April 1963, as it was your duty to do so, for an unreasonable length of time. The court wishes to emphasize at this time that this apparent failure on your part cannot conceivably have contributed in any way to the loss of USS Thresher and those on board. You are accordingly designated as a party before this court. Counsel for the court will now inform you of your rights as such." Afterwards, Commander Hecker acquired the services of Louis P. Gray to represent him throughout the inquiry. In the end, no action was taken against Commander Hecker, and he remained as commander of USS Skylark. Other witnesses testified to various aspects of Thresher's performance tests and quality of work done while in the yard. But overall, the court confidently concluded that USS Thresher was an excellent submarine with a competent and trained crew. In its official report, the court concluded, "The Navy believes it most likely that a piping system failure had occurred in one of Thresher's saltwater systems, probably in the engine room. The enormous pressure of seawater surrounding the submarine subjected her interior to a violent spray of water and progressive flooding. In all probability, water affected electrical circuits and caused loss of power. Thresher slowed and began to sink. Within moments she had exceeded her collapse depth and totally flooded. She came to rest on the ocean floor, 8,400 feet beneath the surface." Senator John O. Pastor said in the wake of the disaster,
"She was the finest product of the shipwright's art, and one of the maritime marvels of this technological age, lead ship of a class designed to run silent, run deep, and run fast, deeper and faster than any submarine of the past. We may never know what destroyed her. The silent forces of the deep are implacable enemies to detailed investigation."
USS Thresher was officially stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on 10 April 1963. As a result of the tragic loss of Thresher, many changes were implemented to prevent further accidents. The Submarine Safety Program, or SUBSAFE, was developed in 1963. This program monitors the design and construction of new submarines to ensure they can remain watertight and survive accidents at sea. SUBSAFE also oversees systems that are exposed to seawater or are critical for recovering a flooded submarine. The Navy also added emergency blow systems that must function at all depths, and hydraulically operated emergency flood control systems to all hull openings for seawater-connected systems. The Thresher uncovered the Navy's limitations for deep ocean search and rescue, and in 1964 it established the Deep Submergent Systems Project, or DSSP. This program included plans to construct a total of 6 rescue submersibles that could operate to submarine collapse depths, and 2 deep ocean search vehicles that could operate to 20,000 feet. In addition, main seawater cooling systems and compressed air systems on submarines were modified to allow for quick actuation in an emergency. The Navy also changed reactor operating procedures, specifically to reduce the amount of time it would take to restart a reactor, and an additional emphasis was placed on training requirements, operating procedures, and inspections. Despite these additional safeguards, the nuclear submarine USS Scorpion was lost in over 9,000 feet of water in May of 1968 off the Azores. No conclusive cause was determined for Scorpion's loss, but theories include an explosion from a buildup of hydrogen gas from recharging batteries, or the accidental detonation of one of its torpedoes. In 1988, 25 years after the loss of the Thresher, the Navy's chief submarine officer, Vice Admiral Bruce DeMars, said,
"The loss of Thresher initiated fundamental changes in how we do business. Changes in design, construction, inspections, safety checks, tests, and more. We have not forgotten the lessons learned. It's a much safer submarine force today."
All 129 men on board USS Thresher were lost, and they remain at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. But their memory, service, and ultimate sacrifice will live on. That will do it for the story of the USS Thresher. You can find a list of all who were lost, along with relevant photos and sources on this episode's show page at shipwrecksandseadogs.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. You can help support the podcast by making a donation at buymeacoffee.com/shipwreckspod. Donations of any amount help me continue to bring you new episodes of maritime history. You can also subscribe to Into History for ad-free access to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs and many other fantastic history podcasts. Go to intohistory.com/shipwreckspod to subscribe. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can find more of his work at seansiegfried.com. Thank you so much for listening. Please join me again in 2 weeks. But until then, don't forget to wear your life jackets.